Welcome to Equipped to Endure. I'm Rusty. Today we are kicking off a new series called the Real Survivor Series, where we're interviewing people who lived through real catastrophic type situations, whether it's earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, or even personal assaults, so that we can glean from their experience and be better prepared ourselves. If this is your first time visiting, greetings. We're happy to have you here. We like to do things like gear reviews, product testing, and survival skills training. If you're new to this genre or if you're an old grizzled veteran in it, you're welcome. You have a place in our community. Please subscribe now so that you can keep up with these great videos as we release them. For our first guest in the Real Survivor interview series, we are going to be speaking to Anne, who gave us her time graciously to talk about her experience in the 1989 San Francisco earthquake. So we welcome you, Anne. So to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about the details of the disaster, like the numbers, the stats that you recall?
Absolutely. It was October 17th of 1989, and I was living right in San Francisco, right on the Embarcadero. And it was a beautiful day. In fact, it was the Bay Bridge series, which everyone was very excited about. The Oakland A's were playing the San Francisco Giants. So everyone in the whole Bay Area had a vested interest in it. And actually, that was a huge blessing, if you want to say it, for that being that day of the earthquake, because so many people asked for the day off to go home. People left work early. So the freeways they figured the freeways were less than 20% of capacity, which ended up being wonderful. They figured the deaths would have been 10 times what they were had that not been happening, because people were hunkered down at home. But it was a beautiful day. Everybody were waiting for the game to start, and the earthquake started at 5:04 that afternoon. And it was they started out saying it was 5.9 on the Richter, but then it went to 6.1. Lasted about 15 seconds, but it felt a lot longer than that.
Now, I didn't look this up, but were any of the aftershocks or tremors impactful at all or big?
There were 250, north of 250 aftershocks that were 2.5 or greater.
Okay, but that's not going to be knocking buildings down.
No, but it's going to demolish buildings that are already starting knocking down. And the scary thing was, we didn't know that earthquake was the true earthquake, or was that a precursor? Nobody knew. So they kept saying, was that just, was there any pressure that was relieved, or is the other one coming? So every time the ground would start shaking again, you'd think, okay, is this going to be the big one? Is it going to be worse? Is it going to be worse?
So I also lived in California, and a couple of years later, there was a big earthquake in Big Bear.
Yeah.
And it was also a bigger one. I think it was a little bit higher on the Richter scale, but it didn't do the damage because it was a small mountain town that reached out. But I do remember, I was a little kid. I think I was 7 or 8, but I remembered there was one really big aftershock. But after the fact, the tremors, it wasn't necessarily about the physical damage that would happen with those for a little kid. I was just on edge because of the big one. And so every little one, it's how bad is this going to be?
Exactly right. Yeah, because you don't know.
Definitely,
that's right.
Definitely puts you on edge.
Yeah.
All right. So any sort of insight into as far as were the earthquake authorities saying, hey, guys, prepare, we're kind of sensing things coming, or there's been pressure building up, we're due for one?
Yeah, they what do they say, that there's over 100 earthquakes in California a year, and usually 3 to 4 higher than 5 point nothing on the Richter scale. So again, I think that we're prepared for earthquakes, but typically you'd feel them, and you'd like you were talking about the Big Bear, and then the ones when I was in Central California, where the pools would slosh, but there wasn't huge damage. There was a lot of damage. And I think the scary thing about this situation was that it moved so much, and you were right in the city, and then immediately had no power. My vantage point was I was on Embarcadero, just so that I could see Bay Bridge where it turned and went across to Oakland. So immediately all the power went out, car alarms were going, and I could see where the Bay Bridge had collapsed, the 50-foot portion of the bridge had collapsed. And then you could see fires up in Berkeley and in Oakland, and the Cypress structure where it had collapsed. And there was still exhaust going in the Cypress structure. it actually collapsed down to 22 inches. So the top of the freeway fell to the second level and just smashed the cars that were in there. So you couldn't tell what it was because there was so much smoke. But it was really scary. And then you could hear the sirens going. And San Francisco is so dense that as a bird flies, the fires in the Marina District were less than 5 miles from where I was. So you could see smoke and you could see the fires happening and fire trucks going and worried about, with no communication, you didn't know how bad things were everywhere. If things were, if there was a tsunami coming, people were talking about that. And it was, yeah, you think you're prepared, but it was scary.
So lots of people are on edge, and we're, again, talking about 1989. So people didn't have iPhones.
No.
They didn't have Twitter. Yeah, Steve Jobs hadn't built that in his garage yet, right? So there wasn't a immediately accessible form of information, right, other than the news. And was there interruptions in cable service or things like that?
We had nothing.
Nothing.
So you had
just hearsay.
Hearsay, and so the place that I was located was right the first exit or entrance as you're getting off the Bay Bridge. So when that part of the bridge collapsed, people they weren't sure more was coming, so they just stopped their cars and they had to evacuate off the bridge. So you have people in tears, screaming, running off the bridge, saying the bridge is collapsing, the bridge is collapsing. But you have no news. So and then there were other parts of the Embarcadero freeway that were collapsing as well along where we were. So your imagination goes wild and you think it's even 10 times worse than it was.
Yeah. As you were painting that picture, I actually tried imagining being on that bridge. That's another thing, because that bridge is suspended up over the water a good distance. So if you're on that bridge, you probably want to hustle off that pretty quick because you're worried another earthquake might take you out with it, right?
Well, and most of the people had either seen the cars go off where it had collapsed, or they'd heard about it, and people are leaving their cars and running off the bridge. It was Panamania. It was crazy.
So could you see, now this is interesting from a psychological standpoint, could you see just sheer terror and panic on people's faces?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Women coming without their shoes on, running down off the bridge. Again, because you felt the earthquake, but you didn't know it was the earthquake, so there's more tremors and stuff happening, and every time there'd be another shake, more bricks would fall. So they just ran off to be safe, and we were right there off the freeway, so much of them gathered in our parking lot and in the vacant land around us. But nobody had cell phones. They were begging to use cell phones if someone had a cell phone to try to check in.
Now, you talked a lot about the sights and the sounds. Any particular smells that you can recall, or smoke or...
Smoke, I wasn't close enough to the smoke. I guess if you could smell fear, I could smell fear. But it just was, like I said, we didn't have fires necessarily, and I was in a building that had post-tension slabs, so we just moved a lot. But you could see fires all over the place and smoke.
Any other, so right during the earthquake and then right after, any other particular sight or experience that just was very vivid in your memory?
Just the fear of people. Again, I think that we take for granted these days the ability to reach out and touch and make sure that everybody's okay. I want you to picture being in a situation where you are... the majority of the people that work in San Francisco do not reside in San Francisco. They reside in the outlying areas. And there's no way to get home. All of the ferries were closed down. People were trapped in the Bay Area BART, which is the Bay Area Transit that goes underneath the water. They're evacuating them. There's no way for these people to get home. No cell phones. All the phone lines are shut down. So we don't know at this point if the main earthquake was in San Francisco or was it actually was more closer to Santa Clara. But you can see fires across the bay. You don't know how bad things are at home, and nobody can communicate. And they can't get home. They can't call home. Many people didn't know if their families were okay, if their homes were still there. So you can imagine, there was a lot of fear and a lot of hysterics. Yeah.
So if they had the technology then, satellite phones or these GPS devices or cell phones or anything like that, what would people have given for the opportunity to speak to their family at that point?
Oh my gosh, everything. I was really fortunate in this way that I was working at an apartment community that we lived at. So I was able to, when the earthquake happened, I threw all caution to the wind. I didn't crawl under my desk. I shoved coworkers and got out of the building.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. You said you were basically throwing them out of the way, right?
You think you're going to just be nice, and I figure I really consider myself
I'm a
to be
leader.
a charitable person, and no, in an emergency you just get out of there. And my first thought was I need to get home to my boys. I had 3 little boys, ages 2 through 9. And I needed to get home to make sure they were okay. My babysitter leaves at 5:00 to catch her ride home. And so I knew the boys were by themselves, even though they were 200 yards away. I ran there immediately. And I was fortunate because I was so close. And I grabbed the phone and just called my mom and said, "You're going to hear about an earthquake in San Francisco. We're all okay." And then it clicked and it was done. So I felt fortunate. We had the people that were coming off the bridge. We of course let them try to go in and use our phone, but there was absolutely no service.
So the landlines were down.
No, not so much the landlines were down. There were some, but there was, circuits are busy.
Oh.
There was nothing. Yeah, you couldn't get out. And they were telling you through anybody who had a radio, it had to be battery operated, but they were saying that Bay Bridge is collapsed, the Cypress structure. We've got fire. The Marina District is on fire. Please don't use your phone. Please don't try to call the police unless you check on your neighbors to make sure people aren't in buildings. And so
we talked a lot about, what was going on, what the news was covering, but what do you remember in particular being the most shocking thing to you at the time?
Not knowing how bad things were everywhere. Again, from my vantage point, I could see all the bad stuff and see that people were trapped and you feel totally, I should say unprepared, because you think you, in a situation like that, will remain calm, but it was really scary. And you don't know the best way that you can be helpful, but protect your family at the same time.
So there's a process we go through when we go through a traumatic experience, right? There's the shock, there's the acceptance element of it. So as soon as you started going through it, right, you had to process what was going on, but what realizations or fears started hitting you right after this happened? I know you mentioned already not knowing, but what was kind of the, oh crap, kind of moment?
Yeah. The area that I lived in, it was south of Market, which was it was just going through regentrification. It was not a great area, and so my number one fear, frankly, was that we were in a controlled access building, but there was no controlled access because there was no power, so all the doors were propped open. And unfortunately, I think disasters bring out the best in people and they bring out the worst in people. And I remember my fear, and my little boy's fear was how we have to sleep with the doors open. What if somebody comes in? And we had been broken into before there in that same apartment, same building.
So that's unnerving. Why did you have to sleep with the doors open?
They're controlled access, and it was all power. It doesn't work unless you've got the power. And so we had to prop doors open. During the day, you had emergency generators that typically it will last 11 hours, the lights. And they were trying to keep diesel fuel in them to keep them going longer, but you can't pump fuel when you don't have power. And so we were asked to leave our front doors propped open so that people could see in the hallways because there was no light. So that provided natural light.
Yeah, that would be unnerving.
Yeah. But then at nighttime, and you don't have, just for airflow and that, we just tried to sleep with the doors open. We all slept together in one room.
So did you do the Macaulay Culkin thing from Home Alone? Did you have Christmas ornaments in the hallway?
No. That would have been a good idea. That movie hadn't come out yet. So.
Oh, that's a good point, right? Yeah, you hadn't been schooled in the ways of home defense by little Kevin McAllister.
Yeah.
All right. Anything big happened to friends or family that were in the area? So we had talked before off camera, and you had mentioned that you were fairly prepared yourself. You had food, you had water, but a lot of people weren't.
No.
So talk a little bit about that. What were friends are dealing with, or families dealing with, who weren't as well prepared?
Like I said, we were fortunate because I was part of management. I had taken a large storage area in the building and had my food storage in there. Now, candidly speaking, I had wheat and oats and, dry milk and things like that saved. I didn't have as much of the macaroni and cheese that my kids would like and that. So I absolutely was prepared, and in that way, but not prepared in the way that necessarily my kids loved to eat what we had there. that's another thing too. You don't know how long it's going to last. We were 8 days without power. So fortunately, I was able to boil water. My boys remember me boiling water for them to bathe in, but it's a tough thing to say. Okay, am I going to give my food away to these strangers or to help these people, or am I going to save it and just make sure I have enough for my family?
You kept the mac and cheese and gave away the wheat.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. No, I didn't have the mac and cheese, but yeah. So
for the others, did you have friends and family in the area at the time?
Not specifically. I had, of course, coworkers and neighbors, but not specifically family.
So in the event, when people started realizing, you mentioned without power for 8 days, that's a big deal. Big deal, particularly in a big city, and that's interrupting logistics. What were the first things that people were rushing to acquire? What was the panic over? So, we ran for toilet paper and Purell, right, with COVID, but what were people running for in San Francisco?
Batteries and water.
Batteries and water.
Yeah. And that's another thing. I had read and learned that you need to keep some cash on hand, and I was pretty good about doing that. But I had probably $400 worth in cash, all $20 bills. So when you go into a grocery store, and first of all, if they had batteries, and you went into a grocery store to buy batteries and you didn't have change and it was $8, you paid $20 because they were not making change. So I learned that you do need to keep some smaller bills there. For that, but batteries were a big deal. I had heard that batteries expired, but my 10-year-old batteries did not last very long. I don't know if you keep them in the fridge or whatever, but some of my batteries only lasted not very long. We had used them for Christmas, so we were pilfering batteries from Christmas toys and that to keep our radios going.
And that's a survival hack for you guys.
Yeah.
Get those batteries out of the kids' toys.
Kids' toys. Mm-hmm.
They do have a purpose.
Yeah. After that, now I have my radio is one of the hand crank kind for a battery because you are so desperate for information. And I remember all huddled around. We were kind of trading around radios. We'd go out into the parking area out in front of our building there, and we kind of trade using up the radios because we didn't know how bad things were. We didn't you had 145 roads closed down. So again, you want information so badly. So we were using each other's radios to try to gather around. Okay, your turn, my turn, whatever, just to get information. That's the big thing.
So the next question talked about this idea of a new form of commerce. So did you find that people started trading with each other for items?
Yeah.
So examples of that.
Well, toilet paper, you laugh at toilet paper. Absolutely toilet paper. Siphoning gas. I am notorious for driving my car on quarter of a tank, and then I fill up when I am in the mood for a Diet Coke or whatever. And I will never, ever, ever do that again, because here we were, even with fuel. And you can't pump gas. You can't go to an ATM. All of that stuff requires power. And with the gas and with the electric, they were still making sure, even if you had gas stoves, they were still going through methodically to make sure there were not gas leaks. So
now, as far from a trading standpoint, though, what were people in the community
batteries
trading?
Batteries were a big deal. Water was a big deal. Light sticks. People want it with flashlights.
Like chem lights.
Chem lights, yeah. They luckily it was pretty close to Halloween, and there was somebody in our building that was giving away the light sticks for Halloween trick-or-treaters. So they passed those out. Those were huge. And again, we tried to ration those so that we throw those down in the hallway for light.
So light was a really big deal.
Huge.
Now that's interesting. Why is that?
I want you to just picture being in an area where there's shady characters there. You don't have any information. You don't know if the world's coming to an end. You don't know what's going to happen the next minute, and it's dark. And that's, again, just a little bit of light. It's, I don't know, psychological, but even with my little boys, they needed a little bit of light to go to bed because it's pitch dark. There's nothing.
Now, I wanted to talk about this a little bit earlier, but we'll jump into it now. There were a lot of injuries associated with the earthquake.
Yeah.
And we had talked about the emergency responders were tied up with real emergencies, like the collapsed freeway. So if you had little knick-knack injuries, things that we may consider more serious, a broken collarbone, a twisted wrist, those kind of things, those were low priority.
Right.
So how did people take care of each other? And did first, Band-Aids and bandages, did those things become things that were traded and passed around?
Yeah, I didn't see that as much as we pulled out our first aid kits. But most of the injuries took place that were like that were in the Marina District, where they and the first responders were there because it was on fire. The Marina District was built on fill from the 1906 earthquake, so they just kind of pushed all the debris down there, and then they built this high end prestigious place to live. And so when the earthquake happened, it was just like jello, and they literally collapsed upon themselves. So you had people in the buildings collapsed. You had parking structures that were all the way down. And so and the fires were burning. They fought fires for 15 hours there. So that's where your first responders really were. And so when you had buildings that were down, that people that were cut or that were hit with falling debris, there were over 2,000 people in San Francisco that were injured.
And there was a story, I don't remember the young man's name. Was it Jose?
It was Julio.
Julio. Can you tell us that story and how traumatic that was?
Yeah. This is one, he sort of, in a way, became the mascot of this situation for many of us in San Francisco. It's easy when there's such trauma and such distress going around that you feel discouraged. And as we were huddled around the radio, there was a little boy named Julio, and he was in the over in the Cypress structure that had collapsed. Mm-hmm. And so there were 42 or 45 people that were killed over there, which again was unprecedented just because people weren't there. But what happened was they could hear him in there. And again, the top of the freeway collapsed to the bottom to 22 inches. And so most people had died immediately in there. But there was a story that we all kept watching, and we watched it for a day and a half. When I say watched it, we listened to it on the radio. But about Julio, they found Julio. They got to Julio. They could hear him in there. It was a little 8-year-old boy, and he was in the back seat, and there were 2 people in the front seat, 2 women in the front seat that were deceased. One had a wedding ring on. I remember them thinking it was his mom. But to try to get him out, they tried everything and had to actually bring surgeons in and saw through the body of what they thought was his mother, but it ended up being an aunt, to get him out of there and amputate his leg there in the Cypress structure. And so minute by, you're just getting the updates. They found him, that he's still breathing. They brought a surgeon in. So it kind of became something that you had some camaraderie kind of looking for the wow. miracle in this situation.
Imagine being Julio seeing that happen.
I know.
Oh.
But he's alive now. He and his sister are alive. And I remember hearing that he's, you kind of follow the situation and that he's doing well. So.
Well,
yeah.
That's a positive from the story.
Mm-hmm.
Going back a little bit to the trading thing, did you see anything like a kind of a mini black market pop up in the area?
Yeah, they actually, you had the big stores like Safeway was handing out water. They were, people were in the streets. You had some people with their flashlights trying to direct traffic, what traffic there was. And the looting took place mostly down on the Market Street area. There's a Safeway down there, and Safeway was handing out waters, charging for batteries, but the littler stores absolutely did increase the prices on everything, the gas stations, things like that. So
now, did you see that move outside the stores, though? Were people opening up their trunks and hawking their wares?
I didn't see that, but I'm sure that happened. So
okay. Now, often in a disaster, neighbors and friends help each other immediately, mm-hmm. but after a couple days go by, that goodwill starts to get burnt out and things start devolving. So what did you see start happening? What kind of crime did you start hearing about, kind of breakdowns in society? What started happening?
I think what you're saying is exactly right. Immediately, they talk about the stories, especially down in the Marina District, where people they had a human line that they brought water from the bay to try to put out the fires.
Like the old fire brigades?
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
absolutely down. And there were, many stories about that. Like I said, people doing traffic lights, people helping, there were people that brought their boats over to help people get home across the East Bay. Because when you're in San Francisco, if you had to drive around to where most of your especially your blue collar, but most of the people were living, that was an 80-mile drive, and you had roads closed down, so no one could get home. So there were people, they were trapped in San Francisco. So people were doing, their boats across and things like that, which was wonderful. We had, so there were all kinds of goodwill to begin with. But you're right, people do tire of it. And then if you don't know how long things are going to go on, you do start saying, wait a minute, I need to protect myself and my family.
Yeah, you start seeing these resources that you were initially giving out, but as they start getting depleted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Even myself, and I try to consider myself a decent human being, but you do start thinking, I need to save this water for my family.
Absolutely. So from a security standpoint, what did people start to do? You mentioned people are getting a little edgy, right? Having these chem lights out. What did people start having to do? And again, this may not have hit your area as much, but what you heard about to set up security and to defend themselves and their family.
You had, again, people watching out. We did the same thing. We traded watching at the front door because, again, we had to leave it open.
So you had
for people.
Night watches.
Yeah, night watches. We had 9 buildings at that property that I was at, and we just traded watching at the front door. Then the men did it for us, which was great, and then we tried to calm kids down. We had one night where we all just opened the hallway doors and let the kids kind of play there in the hallway just to add some normality to their life. But we were in a shady area, so we needed to be watched. And there were car break-ins. People took advantage because your controlled access garages had to be opened all the way because they're electric as well, so manually opened. So car break-ins.
Now, from the night watch standpoint, I assume these guys were armed. Did they have a siren? What were they, that bottleneck into your building, how were they defending that?
We didn't have to go to the defensive mode. I think just having people there watching it at that point, I don't know.
So that was a deterrent enough. At that point.
At that point, yeah.
But if it lasted longer.
Yeah, it could have, yeah. We were the last ones to get power. We were 9 days.
So here's another thing. From a psychological standpoint, at what point first of all, how did the community members kind of decide this was going to be happening? Who's going to be watching the front door? Did you get together and powwow, form your own little tribe and, pick leaders?
I think that from a leadership perspective, because I was in management of those buildings and my husband was there as well, we sort of took that leadership role and made some assignments. Does that make sense? So, and I think that I like to think it had more to do with my role than it does my personality, but that I wasn't bossing folks around. But and people were willing. We did have some people that literally walked out and never came back. Never came for their toothbrush. They left. They were done. They were done.
Hit the road.
They were gone.
They bugged out.
Yes.
That's a bug out situation.
Yeah,
Are they still living up in the hills in California?
I don't know. They could be. I don't know.
All right. So knowing what you do now, what different preps or different precautions would you take to prepare for a situation like that? Because you mentioned you maybe didn't have the food that your kids liked, maybe not enough batteries. What were your takeaways from that event of I need to have this on hand?
I always think that there's different levels of preparedness. There's the preparedness that, things are horrible and you're shooting varmints and eating whatever's going to sustain life. And then there's before that, you're at the point where you need to be prepared because you can't go to a grocery store, but you need to keep your kids comfortable and happily playing bingo or whatever it is. And I jumped from I didn't have that in between. I had the wheat and the old milk and the oats, but I needed that in between preparedness that still provided meals for my kids that they wanted to eat. I did have a few things in my pantry, but in San Francisco, you're living in 600 square feet. You don't have as much space. So I would absolutely have that intermediate comfort dinner so that in a disaster, your family feels like there's some normality in the chaos of what's happening. So I would definitely, that would be my preparation to keep, I don't care if it's canned spaghetti or, spaghetti sauce and noodles.
Mountain House?
Mountain House. There you go. But something so that you can provide a little bit of comfort during that situation. Small bills. I wouldn't store $100 bills anymore. I'd store the smaller bills, and keep your gas tank full, or at least never go below a quarter of a tank with your gas in your car. Flashlights, light, if you've got a little bit of light. And then the other thing, like I said, I immediately got a radio that I can hand crank to charge the battery, not have to rely on.
Now, nowadays, there's a lot of fairly affordable and fairly brawny solar systems.
I just used one.
Uh-huh.
Cool. Charged all of our phones. We were on a called Ragbri, a big ride across Iowa. They powered everything for us, computers, but they didn't have those back then either.
Right,
So,
but now they do.
They do.
So would that be something you definitely recommend people have?
Already purchased some.
Oh,
absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, so we want to kind of finish up the interview with the big so what points, right? So we've kind of scared the viewers a little bit about what can go, wrong in an earthquake. And not to diminish the San Francisco earthquake, but some of these other communities like Chile or maybe these third world, I mean, it's like every building comes down and crushes people, right? So what are the big so what takeaways? We said, and this was something that's interesting, how important light is from a psychological and security standpoint. Having, more of the types of foods that one would regularly eat on hand. The idea of if you're trapped, how would you get home? How would you communicate?
I was going to say, and have a plan. Know that if I don't come home, this is where my kids are going to go. And so that you've got that sense of it's going to be okay till I get there. But people were panicked and screaming, not knowing where their kids were, if they were stuck at preschools or at school. So,
all right.
A plan.
Well, the plan is important now. We had spoken about this previously. That's why we had interviewed you on here. But beyond kind of the shock factor of what was going on, beyond the physical preparations to make, there was an important point that you made about the importance of being kind.
Yeah. I think that, and we saw that, like I said, in a disaster, I think kindness comes to the surface and then people are advantageous. But people really did come together. Sort of like September 11th. It was San Francisco's big deal. In fact, if you look at the newspaper articles, they really focused on the kindness and the humanity of things. People who, I think one story that I remember is that a bookstore that had been there 4 generations had demolished, and the guy, it actually part of his wall fell through and killed 3 people. But they were he wanted just to get as many books as he could out of there. So he put an ad out on the street saying, if anybody can come and help me, I have 10 minutes to go in there. And 400 people showed up. So there were great things happening as well. But there were other situations that were not as great, but...
So it kind of amplifies the situation.
Absolutely.
And that was one thing that I did want to make sure that we emphasize is even though you may be surprised at how good and kind people are in the immediate aftermath, that can also create a situation where people devolve quickly, whether or not they're not as emotionally mature or they're not as considerate of a person. So it can go both ways quickly.
Right.
Now, with that said, and we wanted to emphasize this, that you cannot rely on the kindness of people. You can't just assume, people are going to take care of me.
Mm-mm. And you can't, and I think that you cannot, you do have to think about yourself. I think that we need to share, but you do have to understand that you can't be prepared for everybody. Like I told you, I'd made chocolate chip cookies that day on my lunch break, and I was trying to hand those out, but the part of me is thinking, do I need to save these? How bad is this going to be? But yeah, being prepared is so important.
So would you say part of your plan, you mentioned the importance of having a plan, would it be then important, because you obviously don't want to kick people to the curb and say, go crawl off and die somewhere, right? You don't want to do that. But how do you decide this is what I'm willing to give and this is what I need to keep in my family? Would you think about that in advance now?
I think I would think I'd think of it in advance. I tend to err on the side of just give it away and it'll work itself out. But that the truth is that's what I would do. You think about it, but if somebody's hungry, I'll give them my spaghetti.
Awesome.
So
well, Anne, thank you for being on the Real Survivor interview. We learned a lot from this.
Yeah. And
I hope that our viewers did too. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with them?
Nope. Have a plan. Be prepared. Keep your batteries alive, and have some cash and water.
All right.
And light.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the Real Survivor interview series. We'd like to thank Anne again for her time. And if you liked the video, be sure to hit the like button below. If you didn't like it, please let us know. Really show us by giving the dislike button a double tap so we know just how much you didn't like it. Also, we'd appreciate any sort of comments or feedback to help us make these videos better, as well as others, as well as suggestions for what you would like to see. Thanks again. In Omnia Paratus.